about text analysis for the healthcare industry. We've got a great program ahead of you, so just to do some introductions first, my name's Rauri. I am one of the senior account managers here at Relative Insight, and I have a particular background in healthcare, having been a physiotherapist for about 12, 13 years prior to coming over to Relative Insight. We're joined today by Katy and Lucy from HRW, who are going to be sharing some research that they've done recently on the evolution of vaccine discourse. And then following that, we'll have a panel discussion with Alban and Andrew from Medtronic and Avant Healthcare, respectively. If you'd like to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll be putting those questions to all of our speakers at the end of the session, so there will be time for questions at the end of the session. But please feel free to pop those into the Q&A box as you think of them throughout the day. And without further ado, we'll get going. So the first thing that I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about Relative Insight. So Relative Insight is an AI-based text analytics and visualization platform. And ultimately, it's trying to solve the problem that companies have of having an awful lot of unstructured text data at their disposal and an only ever increasing amount of unstructured text data at their disposal, but without a scalable, efficient way to be able to analyze and extract value from that data. And at Relative Insight, we use a unique comparative methodology in order to understand the differences between those text data sets. And to explain why comparison is such a valuable means of analysis, it's best to share our origin story. So Relative Insight originated in law enforcement, where we compared online conversations in order to understand the differences between young people speaking and masquerading criminals. And the way that we did that was that by comparing those two data sets, we were able to identify the very, very subtle differences between a child speaking in a chat room and an adult doing a very sophisticated impression of one. And through this, protect British children. And we now leverage that same comparative technology in many industries, but in particular in the healthcare space. We're using it to help brands and agencies to analyze social discourse around particular, perhaps patient groups or therapeutic methods. We're helping brands to work with their patient surveys and understand the feedback that patients are giving them, but also, as we're going to hear more from Katy and Lucy, help brands and agencies to share thought leadership pieces and to really put themselves at the forefront of the health industry. And so what is relative health? What Relative Insight recognized through working with our healthcare customers is that up until this point, text analysis solutions for healthcare have meant leveraging very general text analysis solutions against very, very specialized data sets in the healthcare industry. And this led to discrepancy. It also led to an awful lot of reliance on analysts to be able to still read and understand what was being surfaced to them by these tools. And so what we were able to do is recategorize the English language specifically through a healthcare lens in order to surface those significant differences in a much more intuitive and user-friendly way, and adding a layer of contextual analysis rather than leaving things quite so open to interpretation. So what does that actually mean? One piece of work that we've done is looking at conversations around hormone replacement therapies and the menopause over time. And some of the words that you see in this list are words that you'll be unsurprised to see were used commonly around this topic. But obviously words like flashes or sweats or atrophy, even bleeding or extreme, they can mean different things in different contexts. Whereas by specifically looking at the English language through a healthcare lens, we understand that all of these things are related to symptoms. And so we can group those together and bucket them into a topic of symptoms and surface that to the user rather than relying on them having to sift through the data and surface those things for themselves. Another thing that's commonly been a challenge for the health industry is abbreviations and the use of abbreviations in health language. And again, through looking at the English language through a healthcare lens, we're able to recognize these abbreviations and put them into context. So understanding that HRT relates to hormone replacement therapies, understanding that BP is blood pressure and not British Petroleum, for example. So by adding this layer of context, by adding this layer of specificity to the lexicon, we're able to make the platform that much more user-friendly. What's really, really important is that relative health is still underpinned by the robust AI that has been trained over time, but just with this brand new facet. So our linguists have added somewhere in the region of 40 different specific healthcare topics to the existing lexicon that exists within relative insight, just in order to make it that much more capable of dealing with health language and that much more specific to medical language. So that's a brief introduction to relative insight and to relative health. What I'd now like to do is to hand over to the first two of our panelists, Katy Irving and Lucy Saunders from HRW. So HRW stands for Health Research Worldwide, and they're experts in healthcare, pharmaceutical, and diagnostic space. They've got a wealth of experience in a wide variety of therapy areas, and in particular focused on scientifically grounded methodologies that deliver powerful, elevated insights and access the reality of the healthcare landscape. Lucy Saunders is a director at HRW and has worked in the industry for over a decade. She also sits on HRW's internal innovation team, exploring new methodologies, and has a specific interest in utilizing social media. Katy is the head of behavioural science at HRW and leads a team of specialists in psychology, behavioural economics and linguistics, and neuroscience. And then they work to identify the role of non-conscious influences on human decisions. So I'll hand over to Katy and Lucy now to tell us about the work that they've been doing around vaccine discourse.
Thanks a lot, Rory. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you all for joining today to hear a little bit more about some of the insights that Relative Insight has been able to generate. For us, we were looking at the kind of social discourse around vaccines. And this is because the way that topics are typically perceived and discussed more broadly are impacted by social influences. So the kind of things that we observe and absorb from others in the public sphere. And given how modern media has really broadened the participation and accessibility of public discourse in channels like Twitter, it's particularly valuable for us to understand its impact on topics that rely on positive public sentiment, such as receiving vaccinations. Now, analysis of kind of what's said on social media becomes really important, and that's for two reasons. The first is because it impacts people psychologically. So psychological and behavioral research over the last several decades has shown that humans believe that things that come really easily to mind, or as we say in psychology, are very mentally available, are more important and probable. So this is what's called the availability bias. And the challenge is when a topic is really widely discussed or repeated in public spaces, it can create what's called an availability cascade. And this is a kind of vicious or virtuous cycle where, because an idea is really commonly discussed in public spaces, then it comes more easily to mind, and therefore people are more likely to believe and repeat it, creating this cascade. So the volume of content related to topics like vaccinations in a public forum, such as social networks, has an impact on the attitudes and perceptions of vaccinations. The second thing is that analysis on social media really reveals a lot about kind of the changing dynamics within cultures and over time. So we can look at the way that the content around vaccines has evolved over the course of time. So kind of pre-COVID-19 and then during the pandemic, as well as using comparison between countries. So in this case, English speaking countries such as the US and the UK, to identify how different cultural reference points impact that public discourse. And I'll hand over to Lucy to talk a little bit about what we did and what we learned.
Perfect. Thank you, Katy. So what did we find? In our analysis, we looked at tweets from December 2019 as compared with 1 week of the 7th through 13th of December 2020, which is when the first COVID vaccine was delivered to a patient in the UK. In the whole month of December 2019, there were only 2,443 tweets about vaccines, compared with then 51,534 tweets in that single week in 2020. This really underscores the extent to which vaccines were thrust into the public consciousness in a way that they just weren't prior to the pandemic. A common thread in the analysis over time was discussion and debate between pro and anti-vaccine camps. This led to discussions of trust increasing 4.3 times in 2020 compared with 2019. However, a new theme was dominant in 2020, and that was using humour and memification in the debate. particularly the pro-vaccine tweeters using humorous arguments in relation to skepticism about the contents of the vaccine, specifically following the formula, if you've ever eaten, drank, used blank, then you don't need to worry about what's in the COVID vaccine. So for example, if you've ever eaten a salad from a college dining hall salad bar, do not worry about what's in the COVID vaccine. 2021 and 2022 brought an increase in the amount of tweets mentioning politicians, policy and politicization of vaccines. And interestingly, mentions of politicians and policies were on the rise once the immediate threat of the pandemic subsided.
We can see kind of further insights as well, looking at the comparison across countries. So if we go on to the next slide, looking in comparison, we can see, again, between the US and the UK, we can see a couple of interesting differences. One that was kind of interesting when we look at the US and the UK is the way that the different countries' tweets talked about the benefits of getting vaccines. So the UK were more likely to talk about protecting others, and in particular, talking about family, grandparents, mom, dad, that kind of thing. We're much more likely to talk about that than people in the US, and also specifically vulnerable people. But the US was talking more about kind of prevention, so describing the practical needs to get vaccines to healthcare workers or just workers. And later on, they were also more likely to talk about the importance of getting vaccines to children in 2021. Once the immediate threat had kind of passed. And these tweets are interesting because they suggest that in the UK, people are more concerned with protecting their loved ones over frontline workers, but this could just be a kind of symptom of the nature of the analysis, and that the lag in the vaccine rollouts between the US and the UK could kind of account for some of that difference. Another thing that was interesting when we look in comparison is that the US had a huge focus on the kind of logistics and distribution of the vaccine. So this is a particularly unique feature of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the US were just tweeting a lot about logistics and transport of vaccines. And this is again kind of the unique constraints of the COVID-19 vaccine, which required cold storage and therefore kind of cold storage chain transport. But this is interesting as well from a psychological perspective, because there are psychological implications to facing practical challenges. It's what's called logistical friction, which is the psychological implications of practical challenges. So again, if you've ever like registered for or been trying to complete an online transaction and then realize that you need to sign up for an 8-page kind of enrollment process, you might just abandon that transaction. And that's because it's just really psychologically painful to go through all of those hassles. So the US tweeters were certainly kind of going through the psychological pain of trying to puzzle through how they were going to get access to the vaccine. The third thing that we could see in terms of differences between the UK and the US is that the UK was showing a lot more kind of pride and gratitude when the vaccines were being released to them that was absent from the US tweets. And again, this could be a symptom of just the different timing of the rollout between the two different countries, but we identified kind of a contrast in some of the rhetorical devices that were used in each of these countries. And that's specifically that in the UK, people were more likely to talk about kind of getting back to normality. And specifically, a lot of people were tweeting about getting back to the pub. But they were also more likely to use language about contentment in the UK. So things like saying they were proud or grateful or glad, and things like talking about happiness. So this was really absent from US tweets and could indicate kind of a greater reliance of emotive language from the population of the UK more generally, but also it really is a symbol of the kind of important association between having the COVID-19 vaccine in 2020 and more of a gateway back to normality. So overall, one of the things that's really interesting about this analysis is that we can just see the differences between the countries and over time. But one of the themes that really unites all of these insights is that although the health topics are really front and center, they're being influenced by broader global discourses around politicization of everyday life, about the generation of memes and the logistics of the pandemic, which is really interesting because, as Rory mentioned, we kind of work exclusively in healthcare, and we see that although our we and our clients are really focused on the health decisions at the heart of this, health is really only one part of everyday people's lives and is still really strongly rooted in the context of the rest of their lives and the broader media discourses that they are exposed to in the rest of their lives.
We'd welcome any questions and comments.
There we go. Apologies, struggling to come off mute for a moment there. Yeah, a fascinating look into sort of vaccines through a sort of slightly different lens. Always reassuring to know that over here in the UK we're concerned about our loved ones, but also very concerned about getting back to the pub. So there we are. I guess a few questions that I had with regards to this. How did you land on vaccines as a topic and on social as a data source?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, vaccines were a great kind of topic. They've been obviously of super interest because they've been so prominent in our lives over the course of the pandemic. And so they provided a really rich territory for kind of exploring and demonstrating the effectiveness of the relative insight offering in terms of there were lots of levels of comparison. And we went to social media analysis specifically because of kind of its ability to potentially influence people's perceptions in an area that is so heavily influenced by the perceptions of other people. We know that a lot of people are going to social media to get their information and again, sharing their perspectives on social media. So we thought this was a really rich territory to collect these insights and then analyze them through the lens of the relative offering and see kind of what would be illustrated within that and what kind of unique learnings we could pull from this approach.
Yeah. And I know that one of the challenges that our customers have in terms of using social data is getting a clean data set. How difficult, sort of what did you use and what was your methodology around sort of finding the data in order to run the analysis?
Yeah, and that was one of the biggest kind of challenges was trying to figure out what to analyze. And we worked actually in tandem with Eleanor from the relative team to try and figure out kind of what would be the cleanest data set. And yeah, what we really wanted to get was a real kind of snapshot in time to compare pre-pandemic with during pandemic, but also the challenge with analyzing social media on a topic that's as prevalent as vaccines is just the volume of data. And so we decided to go with a kind of an individual week in the year of 2020 because the total volume of information about vaccines was just so enormous. So yeah, in tandem with the relative team, we decided on that week in which the first vaccine was administered so that we had a real kind of benchmark, a real kind of particular time point that we could go back and revisit that would be an effective comparator for how that discourse evolved over time. But yeah, it's not a particularly, no social media data set is going to be particularly clean, but again, using the analysis and working in tandem together, we were able to kind of identify what were relevant insights and how to clean it up to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess then, what are the next steps for this piece of work? How are the findings going to be used, and where do you see it fitting in sort of the bigger picture in terms of your work streams?
Yeah, it's an exciting one. So actually, we're just at the kind of beginning of rolling this out. So we did our final bit of analysis was on the week of the December 7th to the 13th, 2022. So we just captured our last bit of data and have written it up into a kind of white paper that we're publishing on our website, and I think will be made available to some of the delegates who've registered for this webinar as well. And that we're also sending out to a lot of our clients to kind of have some information exchange with them. Certainly clients that work in the vaccine space, this is very relevant to their everyday life about how they can kind of learn how, for example, the evolution of the discourse around vaccines has been influenced by COVID and what are some of the trends, but also it's a forum for us to also talk with our clients about some of the psychological implications of the nature of these kind of linguistic insights and the different way in which the different audiences are using language, or what that reveals about their state of mind. So yeah, it's a real jumping off point for us to have a lot of conversations with clients in the vaccine space, as well as clients in any therapy area that are interested in the benefits of linguistic analysis or social media analysis.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much. We are going to move on now to our panel discussion. I can see that there are a few questions coming through in the Q&A box, which is fantastic. As I say, we'll put those for Lucy and Katy to them at the end of the session in the Q&A right at the end there. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for sharing your work, and we'll jump forward to speak to Alban and Andrew. So for this part of the session, really, we're just going to have an open table discussion, myself, Alban and Andrew, to talk about the type of work that they're doing at the moment, and particularly sort of their approach to text analysis and where they see the value of that. But before we get going, why don't I ask you to introduce yourselves? Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself for us?
Not at all. Hello all, I am Andrew Welp, and I work in the Analytics, Insights, and Strategy group of Avant Healthcare. Avant Healthcare is traditionally a peer-to-peer medical communications agency. We partner with pharmaceutical clients to build and design medical communications to further new therapeutics and emergent therapeutics, and maintain brand position among the peer-to-peer space, meaning healthcare professional to healthcare professional. As our agency evolved, we realized that there is this huge need to catch up with digital. And so our team in particular pivoted to have a much larger role in digital analytics and digital metrics involving social and then digital opinion leadership. And I'll stop there because we'll talk more about that in depth.
No, thank you very much, Andrew. And Alban, would you mind introducing yourself as well?
Sure, Alban de Courville. So I'm part of Medtronic. Medtronic is a medtech giant. I'm specifically working in the diabetes division. It's quite specific within Medtronic because the devices that we produce are used by patients mainly. So I'm only in charge of business insights, so collecting what are the signals from outside of Medtronic and trying to make that inform decisions internally.
Wonderful. Thank you both for joining us, and it's great to have sort of different perspectives on the use of text analysis. And I'd like to start there. What was it that first brought you to this need to get more value out of unstructured text data? Either of you to start.
I guess I could start with that. For us in particular, it was born out of a need to upsell our traditional competitive intelligence business. So looking at new therapies, either on site at a Congress or looking through the traditional publications and means of communicating new therapeutic information for our clients. And when you're looking at such large scale data and the way that social has exploded over the last several years, the need to really understand beyond just a simple qualitative analysis of what's going on in the market, especially on digital, on social channels, really led to us needing to upsell our own and build our own way of designing and measuring the social world out there. And relative insight really kind of was the perfect tool for us because it allowed us to be not only scalable, where we can look at a very niche, small set of maybe a particular set of DOLs, digital opinion leaders, and their conversation, or look at large therapeutic offerings or disease states where we can look and build large data sets and scale that. And not only scale that, but have real inference coming out of it. A few years ago, we had a nascent social media listening offering. And as we were building that out, we were noticing we we're providing value, but it wasn't scalable. It was qualitative value that we really kind of had to cherry pick a little bit. And I hate saying that, but there's only so much you can do without a scalable tool. And relative insight really filled that gap for us to be able to provide robust insight and analysis.
Fantastic. And Alban, I know that you obviously come from a different angle and are working with some slightly different data sources. So, yeah, what was it about being able to get value out of text data that sort of brought you to us?
Yeah. So in healthcare, people think a lot about pharma, but medtech is not at the same level of pharma. So we're not so advanced in using data. So just to set the scene here. So for us internally, as Business Insight team, it was difficult to sell already going out in social media trying to find what Andrew you've just described. So we started with more basic information we had, and we are generating on a regular basis on a cadence level free text data through Net Promoter Score surveys that we post out with people living with diabetes and use Medtronic technologies or healthcare teams. And we had that sitting in our Excel files, not doing anything with this. And we thought that it would be a good entry point to prove the value of free text data in a systematic manner, yeah, to start the journey about, getting, finding these, I would say, these signals through the free text data. So that's how we started the journey, yeah, trying to elevate the value of what we do with these Net Promoter Score surveys.
Fantastic. And I guess, what are some of the challenges that you faced in doing that? For both of you, in terms of, we've addressed this idea of health data being challenging data to both access, but also to analyze. What are the challenges that you faced there?
With regard to analysis, one of the biggest challenges is making sure that you are looking at relevant content, and especially within the therapeutic world we operate in, looking specifically at the peer-to-peer market. We're looking for healthcare professionals, so we need to look at language that has a cadence that is valuable to other healthcare professionals. So that level of language becomes really challenging to even use a tool like Relative Insight, because we're not only is it very challenging language, it is very acronym heavy across the board. Specifically, some of the work that I do is in the endocrine receptor positive space for breast cancer. So when you start combining all these different acronyms together, and you're building these large social queries, and then you're bringing them into a platform like Relative Insight, it still is scalable as Relative Insight makes it. There's still a large level of manual analysis. Rory, you kind of alluded to that earlier with the launch of Relative Health, because it still does take a large amount of time. And oftentimes I will partner with one of our own medical team members to kind of help that. But with the advent of Relative Health, that will become less and less as the platform becomes smarter and understands the lexicon around the healthcare space.
Alban, anything to add? But what about with the sort of survey data that you're working with?
Yeah, so the way we were using free text data was really reactive first. So you identify this country where the NPS drops, and you want to know why. So you go down to, you see that you have a lot more detractors this wave. So you go through the free text data from detractors manually. You do the categorization manually, reading through, right? And then that's how you come up with insights. But this is very biased because you're looking after an issue. Yeah. It's only and it's unscalable. You cannot do that, across all of your data. So really, the challenge for us was to move from being reactive to being proactive Yeah,
Yeah.
that is scalable, automated. Yeah.
Anyway, are you able to share? An example of where using this kind of analysis has helped you to either identify something early or heed off something at the beginning? Is there an example that comes to mind?
Oh yes, absolutely. So we have. Andrew, do you want to go first? No, okay, I go there. Yeah, sure. So absolutely. So we have with some of our components, you know, we may have some quality which is not desirable, yeah, and that hits the support team. So understanding what's happening with the support team, you know, how people react to that, is early signals that we can capture. You can capture them through the call center team, but with the Net Promoter Score, which is a campaign, you know what's recorded in the mind of people, yeah, and what sticks there that you need to work on to improve in the future. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for as well. I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, it would be great to hear from your end. What sort of work does the analysis that you do? What does that inform? What are the insights that you're playing back? The actions that are being taken?
A lot of the times, the actions will be around social listening around congresses. So we'll have new data sets coming out. We have clients working with phase 3 trials or phase 4 trials, and they're reporting those data. And what we will do is we will build a social set around large scale Congress listening and take a few days before the Congress, a few days after, and then all of the Congress, and look at the larger data set of the entire Congress, but also within the therapeutic area to do a really large scale, intense, competitive analysis of a specific therapeutic area, but also measure that against the conversation of the Congress as a whole, so we can understand where a specific therapeutic area is going with regard to new therapies being launched. What is the social conversation looking like among healthcare professionals? And what share does our clients' therapies have versus our competitors' therapies? What share does the therapeutic area as a whole have among healthcare professionals at this particular Congress? If we're looking in the world of breast cancer, we could even go as niche as looking at what is the share of endocrine receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer look like versus triple negative breast cancer versus HER2 negative or HER2 positive breast cancer. So we get to perform these very robust, insightful analysis and be able to actually provide these kind of high-level inferential insights to our clients so that they're able to pivot their conversations around what their market share will be looking like based on these new data. So this whole relative insight allows us to scale this in a way where we're actually able to perform really robust inferential analyses very quickly based on the textual data. Obviously, it involves setting some stuff up, but
yeah, you mentioned quickly there. And how quick? Like, what's the turnaround time for a project like that for you? If you're, from scraping the data and putting things through to being able to deliver something to your client, what sort of timeline are you looking at?
For something like that, the actual time spent in relative insight is usually less than a day per project. I mean, the amount of value and scalability is phenomenal because we're able to build such a robust, a lot of the setup happens prior to relative insight. And that is one area that I've really grown to appreciate, is that within the platform, it is set up so well to build these comparisons. So taking the time, thinking strategic, thinking about what you're actually trying to analyze beforehand, much like our HRW friends did, understanding and building a real business question, and then using relative insight to maximize your value out of that business question or business problem is really how I utilize the platform the most. So the setup prior, building and cleaning the data set is probably the hardest part, because I do a lot of segmentation inside and out, or inside of the data set prior to launching into or uploading into Relative Insights, so that I actually have pre-built variables for comparison.
Fine. No, that's, I mean, yeah, it's just always interesting to get that view on how quickly you're able to turn things around. I suppose because in an ideal world, it would be great to be able to play that back in real time, so that within those congresses, in those conferences, that messaging can be being utilized immediately.
Yeah, I mean, the turnaround time when you're looking at Congress data, we need a solution that's really fast, and Relative Insight provides that. I promise I'm not trying to be a Relative Insight commercial. I'm just very positive on the tool.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And look, it's great to have you along and to share your experience with it. We've talked an awful lot about the past and what you've done. I suppose it'd be nice to wrap up with looking to the future, and I guess what you think having this kind of a health specific lexicon maybe means to your work in the future, but also what you feel like the next steps in terms of leveraging these tech solutions look like for you. I don't know, Alban, if you like, what are your thoughts about what's next perhaps for Medtronic?
Yeah. So a few things next. One thing is to be able to track over time some of the themes that come up, or some of the comparisons. So if you want to compare, so I'm going to talk NPS language now, a detractor versus a passive, across time, are things themes that emerge, how to track against this. Because what we're doing really with this data is to go back to the countries and have action plans behind, right? So in terms of the turnaround time for the typical comparisons, it's about hours or minutes, yeah. When you want to look at early signals that you've not seen before, we do that with the help of your team, Rauri. That's it's in days, it's less than a week, 3 days, yeah. And then what's important for us is go back to the countries and make sure that they have a plan behind that. In the future, what we want to do, you want to use it certainly across social media. Once we see that the internal teams are more ready with using this and getting value out of that, and they see the impact it has, we'll go there in the future for sure. So two things, tracking over time, I think it's one thing that's important for us as we're trying, with this cycle to really improve the experience of customers. And second thing is go broader outside.
What about you, Andrew? I'm sure you've got some ideas about what's next for your analysis in the future.
With the emergence of the health lexicon, excuse me, with the emergence of the health lexicon and how much more confident I think we can be over time with the thematics coming out of the platform, where I see us utilizing this more is in actually driving content development, using Relative Insight, natural language processing to actually understand what makes a successful tweet, what makes a HCP want to like a specific piece of content versus a different piece of content, and then utilizing those advanced inferences to actually design essentially a playbook for social media strategy.
No, fantastic, exciting stuff. I think that's all of the questions that I've got for you two, and I can see that there's some good questions coming through in the Q&A. So I'm going to thank you both for your time and for your discussion and your openness in terms of sharing what you've been doing with the platform. And let's open out to some more questions now. Now, I've got a few here for Lucy and Katy. One thing that's come through is sentiment towards the NHS. So did you hear anything when you were looking at the vaccine work that you spoke about earlier in terms of gratitude or opinions towards the NHS within that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we absolutely did. I think that was part of the kind of core of the pride and gratitude messages. It was interesting actually reflecting on the Twitter data, because it was reminded us of kind of some of the movements that were happening in December 2020. But yeah, there were a lot of people talking about gratitude for the NHS in particular, but there were also a lot of people talking about, gratitude for the companies that had generated the vaccines, and in particular in the UK, AstraZeneca, which was kind of straight out of the gate with the initial vaccine, and also people showing gratitude to the politicians that had kind of supported or gained access to the vaccine. So there was a lot of gratitude being expressed in a lot of directions, but it was really predominantly towards the NHS. So that was a great question from Molly there.
And another question that's come through here is, in terms of sort of filtering out some of the perhaps more technical data, so studies or information sort of from pharma companies themselves, in order to make sure that you're focusing in on that lay population conversation. How did you go about? Firstly, is that something that you felt was important? How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yes, it's absolutely essential, because otherwise we just get, the way that the pharma companies themselves are trying to talk about the vaccine. And I think Lucy and I both have experience with this. This is particularly the case when you're dealing with rarer therapy areas like the ones that Andrew was talking about, and certainly in areas like Alban was talking about in terms of diabetes. Like when you're dealing with more specialist therapy areas, then there's actually quite a lot of noise on social media about the area from pharmaceutical companies, from healthcare professionals, maybe talking about it. And so trying to kind of specifically target the lay population did require us to do a fair amount of kind of filtering. And we did that in tandem with the relative team. So we worked with, again, Eleanor to filter out some of the kind of pharma company promotion to make sure it wasn't influencing our analysis. But the benefit that we had focusing on vaccines, which is such a broad topic, is that actually just the total volume of layperson chatter about the vaccines wasn't, it didn't skew it too much, because there was just so much for us to analyze with the lay people conversations. But it can be a massive problem, as I think we can all relate to.
Fantastic. Andrew, there's a question for you here. Which sources of information do you use in order to get close to the HCP conversation when you're extracting before and after Congress? How do you go about sort of identifying those sources, but then also evaluating them and making sure that you get good quality conversation?
One of the most important things to do is start by segmentation. When you have work with, we personally use Meltwater for our social listening. And within the platform, you can build large queries through which you can actually exclude different aspects of the bio. And then I will do that when I first build a data set. So we look at their name, we look at their screen name, we look at their bio to understand their credentials as best as we can, because in the world we work in, we are looking to for digital opinion leaders a lot of the time who really want to curate that profile as a professional extension of their selves. So we usually find a lot of signals, such as they are an MD or they are a physician working at so-and-so institution. So we do monitor that, and then we filter that in, so to speak. And then from there, I will run an additional set of segmentation outside of the social listening platform to refine that a little bit more through some just computational things. And then after that, we feel pretty confident, depending on the scale of the conversation, as long as we have a large enough data set. The elimination of total noise is impossible. But if you feel confident about the size of your data set, I think you're gonna get, based on that, a really decent sample. And obviously there's some things that you can just obviously eyeball and spot check, which is another thing that we'll do as we filter the data. So as I mentioned before, just the cleaning up the data is the most important part, and using some segmentation and filtering to help clean that up, and some more spot checks and qualitative. Just, does this person say something absolutely ridiculous on their profile. If they do, then we'll just eliminate them.
And I think it's interesting. It's something we've spoken about before. The methodology of comparison itself is that if you presume that there is a similar amount of noise on both sides of the conversation, then actually those two things are going to cancel each other out. And so that's, I suppose, part of the value of comparison as a methodology in this. On that note, one of the other questions that we have here is, and it's probably one for all of the panel actually, given the nature of what relative insight does and the fact that it is rooted in that comparative methodology, how do you land on what you're going to compare against? Like, what are the comparators that you're using in order to sort of surface the kind of information that you're looking at? Anyone can jump in on that.
It's all business dependent. I mean, depending on the questions we're asking, there are some times where I just need to go in and I'll look against the English language as just if I really wanted to just get a pulse of what the landscape looks like. Sometimes I'll just be looking against the English language, looking for trends. Other times it'll be much more robust comparisons. And I think Katy and Lucy have provided a great example of what the tool can do and when you have the right questions asked.
On that, yeah, Katy, Lucy, how did you find, in terms of sort of structuring the analysis that you shared with us earlier, how did you make the decision about those methodologies? Was it based on the metadata that was available, or, could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we were really just looking for something where we could kind of use the comparative approach to make it work. And I think, to echo what Andrew was saying, that it is, in other contexts, it's really business dependent. So we've, for example, looked at before and after they're shown a product profile or something. So, how is it that they're talking about this therapy area before they're aware of this development? And then after, how does that change the way that it's the discussion is happening? Or you can look at, like Alban was talking about, kind of users versus non-users, or different NPS scores, or patients versus physicians, and kind of looking, there's lots of ways we could use comparison. So for the vaccines thing, we were more just kind of thinking, okay, what is going to be most interesting? And also speaking to some of what Andrew was talking about like validity of some of these profiles, what is something that we could realistically kind of do that would tackle the vaccines thing. So looking at country differences, we can identify from metadata the country that they're in, and so that's like easier to use a comparison and identify those groups. And over time, again, we've got metadata that says when the tweets are coming from, so we can use that approach to reliably compare. But yeah, if we were going to look at more of the, layperson versus physician versus, again, maybe pharma voice, it require a lot more data cleaning, like some of the challenges Andrew was just talking about. So yeah, it's really dependent on the nature of the challenge that you're trying to address and what groups you can reliably identify within your data set.
Fantastic.
For us, we have predefined attributes for the data sets. So we have the profile. So if we think of people living with type 1 diabetes, we have a profiling. We have the country they're from. So we do that across time as well. Katy, as you've just said, across time we do that a lot. Yeah. And we are as well using the systematic approach of the platform to help us find this, these key comparison points that's what I call the arising trends that are worth looking at. So with regression analysis, I guess you're finding these new things. So that's how we do that. But we have already a lot of segmentation built into our data. Yeah. Once we go to social media, I'm listening carefully to what you just said, the other panelists, because for us it's a blank field. So knowing how you're going through segmentation is very, very important too. Yeah.
Brilliant. there's a question that's come through asking about comparing different audiences. So, and I'm trying to think, anybody on this call, if you've compared HCPs versus patients, or perhaps sort of brand voice versus consumer voice. I'm aware of some use cases from some of my other customers, but anybody here who's done something like that historically, and how have you seen value from that?
So in our surveys, we typically question people living with type 1 diabetes and care teams separately at the same time. So we could do that. We've not done that in the past. We see typically themes in conversations being different, but comparing would be certainly of interest. So Rauri, you get a new comparison to do for our next wave.
Andrew, you've come off mute. Anything?
Yes, I've certainly compared HCPs versus non-HCPs as part of our analyses, and it depends particularly on what we're talking about, but we definitely do see differences between the way that they communicate and the sources that they share, especially on social. I will caveat everything I mentioned is coming from the lens of social data. That is where I specialize personally. So when we will compare HCPs versus non-HCPs, we'll see different sources of authority, essentially what places they will share from. We'll see who they tag the most. That is one of the most interesting things that comes out of it. You'll see, based on how Relative Insight sets everything up, that if you look at the two data sets, you'll see different people being tagged among non-HCPs versus HCPs. So we start understanding those nodes of influence really across the two different groups.
Yeah, fantastic.
Just a quick one. I was going to say, we're still kind of in discussions about it, but another use case that we have been looking at is looking at other kind of sources of data. So, for example, medical sales representatives and the way in which they present the product, and kind of recording some high-performing sales representatives and some kind of middle or low-performing sales representatives, and comparing the way in which they present the product, both linguistically and kind of structurally. So there's lots of potential use cases as well, looking at maybe internal data or other kind of publicly available data, or like Andrew also talked about, comparing maybe a key group versus just the English language more broadly.
Brilliant. I'm conscious that we're at time. I feel like there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that we could talk about. There's another question that's come through, which I'm keen to get everybody's view on, but it's how we see. The question's put to me: how do we see the evolution of relative health and relative insight with the rise of AI algorithms like ChatGPT, and the fact that they can be used to write, suggest tweets and things? I think from my point of view, and everyone will be very unsurprised to hear that we're very interested in ChatGPT and these kind of tools here at Relative, because look, we've been working in this sort of open tech space for a few years now, and it's great to see more and more people recognizing the value and more going on with that. And we're interested to see how the kind of analysis that we've heard more about today can be used to dovetail with some of those platforms in order to make sure that we're getting the richness of insight and making things as actionable as possible to drive, if we are going to be looking at using AI algorithms to write tweets, Relative Insight is very much something that's going to be able to help feed that algorithm and give it more information. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add in a couple of minutes on the future of text analysis in the healthcare space.
Well, I'm for one, Rory, see an opportunity for you all, given your origin story, to identify which chats are coming from ChatGPT, or what tweets are coming from ChatGPT versus those that are coming from real humans, something like that. Whether, you might actually start to get to the root of some of that, weed out what are the legit humans and what's the AI.
No, for sure. Anybody else with anything to add on the future of text in the health space? If not, then we'll wrap it up. Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much to everybody for joining today, and in particular to our four panelists. As mentioned at the beginning, hopefully by Wednesday next week, you'll receive a link to the recording of this session, as well as to the white paper that HRW are producing off the back of the research that they have, that they've been doing. Obviously, if you are interested in relative health, if you're an existing customer, reach out to your account manager and they'd be more than happy to give you a demo. And anybody else, if you'd like to hear more, then please reach out. We'd love to show you relative health and relative insight. But thank you very much, everybody, for your time, and yeah, enjoy your mornings or afternoons, depending on which side of the globe you're on. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much.